In the climate-controlled vault of the British Museum, beneath the ordinary noise of modern London, there is a clay tablet that reads like something it should not be. Catalog number K2950. A Neo-Assyrian copy. 7th century BCE, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh's royal library. The cuneiform is dense, methodical, procedural. 8 columns of text pressed into a surface, roughly the size of your hand, as if the tablet were designed to be held close, studied, close, worked with close, not admired at a distance. The clay is cool. It is heavier than you expect, because fired earth keeps its weight. The marks are the pressure of a reed stylus, tiny wedges that once sank into wet mud, then hardened by fire into permanence. It is part of a series the text itself treats as burning. Not burning as metaphor, burning as action, burning as method, burning as the center of an all-night procedure. And the instructions are explicit. Take a figurine. Speak these words in this order. Burn the image at this moment of night. Do it again the way the tablet says to do it again. And the tablet promises something that should, by our ordinary assumptions, be impossible. That through correct procedure, a mortal priest can redirect the attention of divine beings, can intercept what has been decreed, can resist carefully, narrowly, precisely what the gods have set in motion. This is not a prayer. It isn't a plea. It is a manual. And that difference matters because it changes what kind of world the text assumes. In a world where prayer is the only tool a human being can only ask and wait, only hope the request is heard, only hope the answer is mercy. But K2950 is written as if asking is not the central action. It is written as if doing is the central action, as if there are steps that, once taken correctly, have consequences regardless of the priest's mood, regardless of the priest's sincerity, regardless of the priest's fear. It reads like engineering. Not because it uses modern terms, of course it doesn't, but because it is obsessed with sequence, with timing, with the right materials at the right hour, with language treated not as expression, but as function. And yet the British Museum does not advertise K2950. It sits in storage, living mostly in footnotes in specialist editions, in the narrow light of Akkadian grammar and ritual studies. It is handled by people who sign forms, wear gloves, and already know how to read what most visitors never even notice is there. The mainstream interpretation when it acknowledges tablets like this is careful, measured, safe. These rituals, the argument goes, were symbolic actions, psychological comfort for frightened people living under capricious deities, theater for the powerless. A performance stage to create the feeling of agency in a world that offered very little actual control. And if we only had one tablet, one isolated set of instructions, this would be easy to accept, easy to place inside a familiar story about religion and fear. But K2950 is not isolated. It sits inside a vast corpus, hundreds of tablets, excavated, thousands estimated to remain in the ground, that collectively describe a system. A technical literature preserved by priesthoods in Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria. A literature that speaks of demons, yes, but also of divine messengers, of enforcers, of forces, sent by gods of afflictions that originate not in evil outside the divine order, but inside the order itself. And the procedures don't always distinguish the way we want them to distinguish. The method for expelling a demon and the method for deflecting a divine curse often share the same architecture, the same ritual logic, the same operational grammar, the same assumption that correct procedure changes outcomes. So the question returns immediately, and it returns in the uncomfortable form the tablets seem to prefer. What if these texts are not mainly about serving the gods? What if they are about surviving them? That question is not comfortable because it presses against the story we like to tell about ancient religion, primitive people projecting their fears into the sky, then kneeling in the dust. But Mesopotamian ritual literature doesn't always kneel. Sometimes it instructs, sometimes it binds, sometimes it declares, sometimes in its own vocabulary it constrains. And that means we have to slow down and watch what the text is actually doing, not what we assume it must be doing. We begin with a tablet in a vault. We will end with a question that does not resolve cleanly. But between beginning and end, we will follow the material, where it leads through manuals and amulets, incantations, and architectural defenses, through procedures written with the same precision used to record grain shipments and silver loans. Because that too is part of the atmosphere here Mesopotamia invented, writing for transactions, lists, inventories, who owned what, who owed whom. How barley moved from warehouse to temple, to palace, to the people who worked the fields under a god's nominal authority and a king's actual control. Writing was accounting before it was literature, procedure before it was poetry. And when that scribal precision turned toward the divine, something happened that we are still trying to name. The gods were listed, their attributes enumerated, their relationships mapped like royal genealogies, and their interactions with human beings were recorded not only in the language of awe, but in the language of clause and consequence, condition and result. K2950 is one shard of that larger habit, the habit of treating the invisible as something that can be worked with, not only worshipped. So we take another step, slowly, not to decide what is true, not to win an argument in the opening minutes, but to listen to what this literature assumes about power. Because the Mesopotamians ask the central question differently than we do. Not do the gods exist, but given that they exist, what do we do about it? And notice how the tablet speaks. It does not try to persuade you into belief. It assumes a premise that words arranged correctly participate in reality the way written contracts participate in economy. In Mesopotamia, a mark is not decoration. A seal impression transfers property. A line of wedges binds a debt. Procedure once written becomes portable. So when scribes wrote down the invisible curses, oaths, hostile forces, they often wrote it the same way they wrote everything else, as steps, as sequence, as something that can be done correctly or incorrectly. For now, we don't force a conclusion. We just hold that premise in mind and move outward into the scribal world that made a ritual manual feel natural. The temptation is to treat a ritual text like K2950 as an exception, an odd corner of the archive where magic accumulates, separate from the serious business of civilization. But Mesopotamia does not really allow that separation, because the same hands that wrote lists of barley wrote lists of gods. The same schoolrooms that trained accountants trained ritual specialists. The same obsession with correct signs, correct sequences, correct repetitions, an obsession that makes a loan contract legible, also makes an incantation legible. So when we say this is a manual, we are not importing a foreign category. We are noticing what the tablets themselves already do. They treat their own knowledge as operational, transmissible, preservable, capable of being copied without losing its function. And that raises a second question, one that returns and then returns again because it is always sitting behind the first. If procedure can be written down, and if written procedure can be transmitted, then who owns it? Does knowledge belong to the gods, the way the sky belongs to the gods? Or does it become once recorded something that moves through human hands, the way property moves through human hands? The Mesopotamians lived inside a world where the written mark changes power. A seal impression on clay is an authorization. A tablet is a witness that outlasts the witnesses. A record can outlast a king. And so when the scribal gaze turns toward the divine world is not only sung about, it is cataloged, it is enumerated, it is treated as if it has terms, condition and consequence, action and result. This is why the ritual corpus can feel so unsettling to modern readers. We expect religion to be about submission and magic to be about rebellion, and we expect the ancients to be blurry about the difference. But the ritual tablets themselves are not blurry about method. They are exacting about method. The uncertainty is not in the procedure, it is in our categories. And now we circle back to the central Mesopotamian question, the one that in their text comes before metaphysics. Not, do the gods exist? But given that they exist, what do we do about it? Because if the gods are real and their attention matters, then life is not merely about belief. It is about management, about timing, about proper handling of forces that can bless but can also afflict. And that in turn explains why the ritual literature is so expansive, why it accumulates, why it is copied and recopied, not because it is entertainment, but because it is infrastructure knowledge for navigating a world where divine force is not automatically benevolent. The tablets themselves tell you that this knowledge did not begin with the priests who wrote it down. They trace it backward through lineages of learning, backward through chains of teachers, backward sometimes to a time before the cities were rebuilt, before the flood that shattered civilization and forced survivors to begin again. And here we meet a name that will return with strange persistence across Mesopotamian literature, the Apkallu, the seven sages, the wise ones, the teachers from before. They appear as a memory of an older instruction knowledge that came from the deep, from Enki, from the god associated with the Apsu, the fresh waters under the earth, the god who in story after story knows how systems work, not only how to enforce them, but how to bend them, how to find the technicality inside the oath, how to move information across a boundary that power claims is sealed. The texts that mention the Apkallu are remarkably consistent for something we are trained to call myth. They are always seven. They always predate the flood. They are always associated with Enki, and they are always described as transmitters, bearers of instruction from divine realm to mortal practice. Later lists preserve their names with ritual seriousness: Uana, Uaneduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalana, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, Utuabzu. And whether we picture them as fishmen rising from water, or as winged figures flanking doorways in stone reliefs, the functional claim remains the same they taught. They brought down what had to be known. Not only how to worship, but how to operate. How to build temples according to proper proportion. How to perform rituals at proper times with proper materials. How to speak words that accomplish effects because the words align with underlying structure, underlying pattern, underlying decree. This is the Mesopotamian self-understanding civilization did not arise from human improvisation alone. It arose from instruction, from the transfer of procedure, from knowledge that the culture insists existed before the culture. We can call that an origin myth, and academically, we should. We can place it beside Prometheus and fire beside other cultural claims of divine transmission. But we should also notice something about the emphasis here. In many traditions, divine gifts are punished. They are stolen transgressive, the cause of heavenly rage. In Mesopotamia, the sages are commissioned, sent, delivered. The knowledge is framed as necessary, necessary to build, necessary to maintain, necessary to survive. And that necessity changes the tone. It suggests at minimum that one divine faction wanted humans equipped, not ignorant, wanted humans capable, not helpless. And that brings us back again to K2950. If the ritual manuals are heirs to antediluvian instruction, if the priesthood saw itself as custodian of what the Apkallu taught, then the manuals are not just comfort, they are inheritance. An inheritance is dangerous because it does not stay where you put it. It persists, it transfers, it outlasts the ones who wanted to control it. So, we keep moving slowly toward the pre-flood hinge. The tablets themselves highlight the flood story, the oath, and the moment. Enki speaks, not to a man, but to a wall. Because that moment is not only about survival. It is about transmission, about how knowledge crosses a boundary, divine decree tried to enforce. And it is in its own way the first proof text for the entire ritual corpus, a mythic scene that explains why mortals possess procedures at all. And notice the inversion this creates. In a purely devotional model, the human is always downstream, gods decide, humans react. In a procedural model, the human can sometimes act first, not by overpowering the divine, but by aligning with rules the divine is said to respect. That is the unsettling possibility. The manuals keep opening, then partially closing, then opening again. Not absolute freedom, not equality, something narrower but real leverage through timing, through words, through materials prepared the right way. And even if we decide as modern readers that none of this worked in a physical sense, we still have to ask why the culture insisted on writing it like this. Why it preserved steps with such stubborn care. Why it treated variation as danger. Because symbolic theater invites improvisation. Technique fears drift. The ritual tablets fear drift. Before the flood, before kingship descends again, before the cities are rebuilt, the Mesopotamian archive places a moment that feels almost like a key being turned. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds a fragmentary tablet cataloged as CBS 10673, excavated from Nippur. Old Babylonian period, roughly 1600 BC, in its written form, though the story it preserves presents itself as older than its own clay. The text is known to scholars as the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian flood story. Much of it is missing 2/3 lost to time, to damage to the casual violence of millennia. What remains is Sumerian cuneiform, a language the Babylonians themselves treated as ancient, a language preserved long after it was no longer spoken because it carried authority. And in those broken lines, there is a detail that academic translations note often quietly, as if not to lean on it too hard. Before the flood comes, Enki warns a man named Ziusudra, but Enki is bound. He has taken an oath with the other Anunnaki. He has agreed to let the flood proceed, to let humanity be destroyed, to reset what the senior gods consider a failed arrangement. The text is explicit about the constraint oath binds even divine will. So Enki cannot speak directly to Ziusudra. He cannot do the simple thing. And this is where the story turns into something procedural rather than merely dramatic. Because Enki does not simply break the oath in a burst of sentiment. He does what the rest of Mesopotamian ritual literature will teach priests to do again and again. He finds the technicality. He speaks to a wall, a reed wall in Ziusudra's dwelling. He addresses the wall in a voice loud enough for the man on the other side to hear every word. He tells the wall how to build a boat, what materials, what dimensions, how to survive, what is coming. The other gods cannot claim he violated his oath, because formally he has not spoken to the human. He has spoken to architecture. It is clever, yes, but the text presents it as more than cleverness. It presents it as method, a way of transmitting information through the structure of rules rather than by stepping outside the rules. And that matters because it becomes a foundational scene for everything that follows. It says divine authority is real, but it is not simply raw force. It operates through procedure, through council decisions, through oaths, through constraints that even gods acknowledge. And if procedure constrains gods, then procedure becomes a terrain mortals can learn. That is the uncomfortable implication. Not that mortals are stronger than gods, not that mortals can declare independence, but that mortals, if they possess knowledge, can sometimes move inside the same procedural space. A wall can become a channel, a technicality can become a bridge, and once that bridge exists, once it can exist again. CBS 10673 preserves the memory of knowledge crossing a boundary divine decree tried to seal. The flood is meant to erase, but the warning is meant to preserve. And the warning is executed not through open rebellion, but through an exploit of formal constraint. Enki speaks to the wall. Ziusudra hears through the wall. The flood comes, life survives, and with life survives something else, the idea that information can outlast decree. This is why the pre-flood sages matter here. The Apkallu tradition insists that the foundational patterns of civilization, the me, the decrees, the protocols, were taught before the flood. It insists that what needed to be known was already known, already transmitted, already installed into human practice through instruction from Enki's realm. So the flood becomes not only a catastrophe, but a test. Can knowledge be erased? The texts answer in their own way, no, or at least not entirely, because if Enki can preserve a remnant through a technicality, then he can preserve memory through a technicality. He can ensure that what the sages taught is not washed away with the cities. The tablet fragment is broken, but what remains is enough to establish the pattern. Survival is procedural. Preservation is technical. The gods decree, but knowledge navigates. And notice how this aligns with the tone of K2950. A manual assumes repeatability. A technicality assumes rule. A ritual assumes structure. CBS 10673 gives those assumptions an origin story. It says the first great transmission was not a sermon, not a revelation in the modern sense, but a workaround. a rule exploited in order to move information where it was forbidden to go. So we pause on that because it deserves time. If the divine assembly can be bound by oath, then the divine assembly is not omnipotence. It is governance. If governance can be worked around by those who understand its letter, then knowledge becomes a kind of leverage. And if knowledge becomes leverage, then the question is not simply whether the gods exist. The question becomes who controls the mechanisms by which divine power is expressed. That question is what the ritual corpus keeps circling. It never states it in modern political terms, but it stages it again and again in oaths, in loopholes, in procedures that bind and release, in the idea that what is decreed can sometimes be loosened. So the flood story is not only a story of destruction, it is also a story of transmission. A story that explains why a priest can stand in a temple courtyard under stars and believe that correct words spoken at the correct hour can redirect what the gods have set in motion. Because once long ago, correct words spoken to a wall redirected a flood. And the memory of that redirection preserved in clay becomes the background assumption for an entire civilization's ritual technology. From here, the texts widen their frame. They place the wall-speaking god inside a longer lineage, the 7 sages, the chains of scholars after the flood, the idea that instruction did not die with the cities. We follow that lineage next, because it is how the priesthood explains its own authority, not invention, but inheritance. And think about what a wall is in this context. It is not a person. It has no will. It cannot be persuaded or threatened. It is simply structure, and that is why it works as a channel. A wall is the seam in a rulebook, the place where language about intention fails to capture every possible pathway for sound. Enki uses the seam. He does not smash the system. He slips through it. That is the kind of intelligence Mesopotamian ritual texts admire, not heroic defiance, but precise navigation. Not shouting at the heavens, but finding the clause that allows a sentence to be spoken. And if a god can do that, the priesthood later asks, quietly over centuries, what can trained humans do with the same kind of precision? After the flood, the stories say kingship descends again. Cities rise again. The world resumes changed but functioning. And yet the Mesopotamian texts are strangely insistent that something did not need to be rebuilt from scratch knowledge. The Apkallu in the tradition belong to the time before the waters. Their era ends. But what they taught does not end. The lists that preserve them also preserve what comes after them. Human successors, scholars learned one's umanu, who inherit the instruction and keep it moving forward, generation to generation, city to city. This is how the priesthood explains its own existence, not as improvisation, not as invention, but as continuity, a chain of transmission that survives disaster because it is treated as more valuable than architecture. And the evidence for that self-understanding is not only in myths about sages, it is in the way the ritual literature behaves. It behaves as if drift is dangerous. It behaves as if the words must be kept. It behaves as if the sequence must be preserved. We see it in the persistence of Sumerian. By the first millennium, Sumerian is no longer a living tongue, yet it continues to appear in incantations, in ritual formula, in technical terms that refuse translation. The dead language becomes a tool kept because it carries weight, kept because it carries authority, kept because the procedure is said to be old, and oldness is part of what makes it work. This is not unusual in itself. Ritual languages freeze in many traditions. But in Mesopotamia, the freezing is paired with an almost bureaucratic anxiety about correctness. scribal schools copy the same formulae across centuries. Variants are noted. Explanations are added in Akkadian. But the core words are kept like a component that cannot be swapped without breaking the device. If we listen to that behavior, what we hear is a claim the procedure is not merely symbolic. If it were only symbolic, innovation would be easier. Improvisation would be safe. You could use new words and still create the same emotional effect. But when a culture treats a syllable like a hinge, when it fears mispronunciation, the way an engineer fears a misaligned joint, it is telling you what it believes about causality. It believes the cosmos is structured. It believes actions have predictable consequences. It believes there are mechanisms, and mechanisms can be operated. This is where the concept of the me enters the picture as more than a mythic curiosity. Because the me are the Mesopotamian name for structure made portable. In Sumerian, the word is me. In Akkadian, parsu, often translated as divine decrees or divine powers. Though the translations never quite capture the paradox, the texts are comfortable living with the me are both objects and principles. Physical items that can be held transferred, stolen, and at the same time, patterns that structure reality itself. Kingship is a me. Priesthood is a me. Writing is a me. Judgment, warfare, sexuality, craftsmanship, me. Protocols of civilization understood as existing before civilization and then being allocated into it. This is why the story of the sages feels in Mesopotamian thought less like fantasy and more like explanation. Civilization runs on protocols. Protocols have origin. Protocols are transmitted. The apkallu are the narrative form of that transmission. And Enki is consistently the one who holds the treasury, the god of deep, fresh waters. Wisdom, craft, the one who possesses the me and the apsu and administers cosmic order through allocation rather than through constant enforcement. If that sounds abstract, the myths refuse to keep it abstract. They dramatize the me as things that move. Which brings us to one of the most revealing scenes in the entire corpus, the story in which Inanna goes to Enki, and Enki, through a familiar vulnerability, lets the me go. It is often read as comic. But underneath the comedy is a statement about the architecture of power. Authority is not inseparable from the being who holds it. It can be transferred. And once transferred, it may not be easily returned. That logic is not confined to myth. It is the background logic of ritual. If power can be mediated through instruments, then instruments can be handled. If me are not merely ideas but operational patterns, then those patterns can be invoked, installed, reinforced. This is how a priest can imagine himself as operator rather than beggar. He is not inventing power. He is applying distributed power me already in circulation, through procedures preserved from before, through words preserved from the sages, through techniques attributed to Enki, because Enki is the administrator of the treasury. So we move into Inanna's theft, not as an entertaining aside, but as a demonstration. Because before we can understand why the priesthood believes it can bind, deflect, loosen, and burn away, we have to understand the premise. The myths keep repeating. Divine authority in this world behaves like something you can carry, and what can be carried can be taken, and what can be taken can be used. The tradition does not merely claim there were sages. It claims there were successors, scholars, experts, the learned ones who inherit and continue. It treats knowledge like a lineage, something you can trace, certify, defend against dilution. A king is legitimate because kingship is a me that descended. A priest is legitimate because priesthood is a me that was allocated. And a procedure is legitimate because it can be traced backward through teachers, through tablets, through the authority of those who first received it. This is why ritual specialists record genealogies. The IPU, the exorcist specialist, does not simply claim he knows. He claims he learned in a chain until the chain reaches the origin point the culture treats as real instruction from Enki's realm. And the continuity in the tablets is the material echo of that claim. Old Babylonian rituals remain recognizable in Neo-Assyrian copies. Sumerian incantations remain embedded long after Sumerian speech is gone. The language fossilizes, and the fossil is treated as functional. So we circle back again. If knowledge is inherited, it begins to behave like property. It can be guarded, transmitted, stolen, lost, recovered. In cultural imagination, it starts to resemble the me themselves, both principle and possession. And that is why the myths insist that authority can move. Because writing taught a civilization that what can be recorded can be carried. And once you accept that premise even as premise, the next scene becomes inevitable. If authority is mediated through instruments, then instruments can change hands. Sometimes by force, sometimes by stealth, sometimes as the texts like to remind us through a moment of loosened control. Inanna goes to Enki not to pray, but to acquire. And Enki for one night becomes the proof that even a god can misplace what he holds. The story of Inanna and Enki is preserved in multiple fragments in Sumerian originals and later Akkadian renderings. The details shift the way details always shift across copying. But the core movement stays stable because the core movement is the point. Inanna, goddess of Uruk, of love and war, ambitious and young, in the texture of the narrative, decides she needs the me. Not some. All. The complete set that Enki holds in the Apsu. And she does not march in with an army. She does not seize the treasury by violence. She prepares herself. She adorns herself. She goes as honored guest. Enki receives her. He hosts her. He prepares a feast. And he drinks. The texts are explicit about that detail. The god of wisdom becomes drunk on beer. And in that loosened state, whether we read it as weakness, generosity, carelessness, or something more complicated, Enki begins to hand over the me. One after another. Kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld. Ascent from the underworld. The arts of love and the arts of war. The arts of judgment. Over 60, me cataloged in the narrative, transferred from the god who holds the treasury to the goddess who intends to install them in her city. Then Enki sobers, and he realizes what has happened. He sends his vizier to retrieve the ME, to take them back by force if necessary. But Inanna has already traveled. She has already reached Uruk. She has already installed the me in her temple. The transfer is complete, and Enki's attempted recovery fails. The ME remain in Uruk. If we read this as comedy, we miss what the text is saying underneath the laughter. It is staging a claim about authority that is both simple and destabilizing power can move. Divine power is not an aura inseparable from the divine body. It is mediated, it is held, it is allocated. And because it is held, it can be lost. Because it is allocated, it can be misallocated. Because it can be transferred. It can end up somewhere it was not meant to end up. This is not a minor detail. This is the architecture of Mesopotamian divine politics. The gods do not simply have authority in the abstract. They possess instruments and patterns. They administer. They distribute. They protect what they hold. They fear theft. They fear loss. They fear most of all the wrong hands acquiring the wrong protocols. And once you see that, you start seeing the same logic everywhere. The flood narrative hinges on an oath, a procedural constraint, and a loophole that allows knowledge to move. The sages' tradition hinges on instruction, a deliberate transfer of civilization's protocols from Enki's realm to human practice. And the ritual manuals hinge on the idea that correct procedures remain operational, regardless of who performs them, because procedure is not the property of mood. It is the property of structure. So we circle back again to the question that keeps returning in different clothing. If the ME can be transferred between gods, what prevents power from moving downward? Not total power, not the kind of power that makes a human into a god. The texts never grant that fantasy, but partial power, distributed power, authorized power. The kind of power a priest needs to consecrate a house, dissolve an affliction, loosen an omen. The kind of power that feels less like worship and more like operation. This is where modern readers tend to retreat, because it is easier to keep religion and technique separate, easier to keep gods as pure sovereignty and humans as pure petition. But the Mesopotamian archive keeps complicating that separation. It keeps showing power as something structured, administered, and therefore potentially navigable. Enki's regret does not invalidate the transfer. That is another crucial detail. He does not annihilate Uruk. He does not strip Inanna by brute force. Once the ME have been installed, the situation becomes real. The transaction, however it occurred, becomes part of the order. In other words, procedure once completed creates conditions even a powerful actor may have to accept. And that principle is not only about gods, it is a principle any ritual technician would recognize. If you perform a consecration correctly, the space is consecrated. If you install protection correctly, the protection stands. If you bind a force correctly, the force is bound until the binding degrades or is undone. So, the myth about a drunken god and a determined goddess is also a parable about the kind of world ritual manuals assume a world where results can follow from correct operation, even when higher authorities would prefer the operation not to have happened. And if that is true among gods, it becomes thinkable among mortals. Thinkable, at least, that a trained human can operate inside divine systems with more than helplessness, not because the human is stronger, because the human knows, because the human has access to authorized instruments that are already in circulation, because the human has inherited procedures that align with cosmic structure. And now, once again, the story demands that we widen. Because the me are not the only instruments the myths treat as transferable. There is another object, another supreme mechanism that makes the vulnerability of divine authority even clearer: the Tablet of Destinies. If the ME are the protocols of civilization, the Tablet of Destinies is the protocol of fate itself. And the myths insist repeatedly that it can be stolen, which means fate too is mediated, which means authority, even at its highest level, depends on possession and procedure. And once you accept that again, even as premise, the ritual literature stops looking like theater and starts looking like what it claims to be a technology of navigation inside a structured cosmos. Notice how familiar this logic would have felt to a culture built on clay contracts. In a legal tablet, the moment the seal is pressed, the deed becomes real. Regret does not reverse it. The witness list does not evaporate. The mark outlasts the mood that produced it. So when Enki sobers, the text does not treat his regret as cosmic veto. The me have moved. They have been installed, and what has been installed is now part of the functioning order, even if the transfer began in drunkenness. That detail matters because it tells you what Mesopotamians believed about systems. Once a procedure is completed correctly, the system updates. The world changes state. And then everyone, human or divine, must live with the updated state until another procedure changes it again. Ritual technicians inherit that worldview. They work as if the cosmos has states thresholds, bindings releases, and that is why they write manuals. Because in a world of procedures, memory is power. If the story of the me teaches that the protocols of civilization can move, the stories of the Tablet of Destinies teach something even sharper. The protocol of fate itself can move. Different myths preserve the scene. The most famous are the Enuma Elish creation epic and the Anzu myth. The names shift, the emphasis shifts, but the core claim repeats with unusual insistence. The Tablet of Destinies is an object. It can be held, it can be seized, and whoever holds it can decree. That is why it matters. In the Enuma Elish, Tiamat prepares for war against the younger gods. She appoints Kingu as commander, and she gives him the Tablet of Destinies. The text describes the effect as immediate and structural. With the tablet in his possession, Kingu has authority over the Anunnaki. He can command. He can shape what will be. The younger gods are terrified. Not because Kingu is personally stronger than all of them, but because he holds the instrument. As long as he holds it, they cannot simply decide his defeat. They cannot easily decree what will happen to the one who holds the power to decree. Marduk succeeds where others cannot, and when he kills Kingu, he seizes the tablet. Authority shifts again. The crisis ends not only because an enemy dies, but because an instrument returns to the correct hands. The Anzu myth repeats the same vulnerability in a different key. Anzu is a divine bird, a storm being a creature born within the divine world itself. He steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil while Enlil is bathing. The theft is almost intimate, almost mundane, and that mundanity is part of what makes it frightening. The tablet can be taken in a moment of inattention, and once Anzu has it, the gods cannot simply order him to surrender it. The instrument makes him unchallengeable. Multiple gods attempt to recover it and fail. Finally, Ninurta succeeds through cunning and violence. The tablet is retrieved, order is restored, but the exposure remains. Divine authority depends on custody. The myth is not shy about this. It does not soothe you with the idea that power is intrinsic and therefore safe. It insists on a more bureaucratic truth. Power is administered through things that can be lost. So now we place this beside the ritual corpus, and we let the implications breathe. If divine power operates through instruments, me tablet, then instruments can be distributed. They can be guarded. They can be stolen. They can be recovered. They can be installed. which means the divine realm in Mesopotamian imagination is not only a realm of overwhelming force, it is also a realm of procedures, vulnerabilities, and logistics. And if that is true, then a priesthood trained in procedure is not automatically absurd. It becomes, in a way, expected, because if the cosmos runs on protocols, then someone must know the protocols. This is why scribal training takes years. This is why tablets are copied with obsessive precision. This is why pronunciation matters. Because if the difference between holding and not holding the tablet of destinies is the difference between authority and helplessness, then the difference between correct and incorrect procedure can also be the difference between protection and exposure. We return again to the same loop. Not are the gods real, but given that the gods are real, what mechanisms shape how their power expresses itself? And if those mechanisms are structured, then structure can be learned. Learned does not mean mastered. Learned does not mean controlled. It means navigated. A ship can be navigated without owning the ocean. A ritual can be navigated without owning the divine. The priesthood's claim, implicit in manual after manual, is that the cosmos has rules, and rules can be worked with. And this is where the distribution of me becomes crucial. The myths insist the gods do not perform every function directly. They allocate. Kingship is given to mortal kings. Priesthood is given to mortal priests. Writing, metallurgy, agriculture, judgment, distributed. So, mortals in this framework already hold instruments of divine order. They hold them because the system requires them to hold them in order to function. A civilization cannot run if gods do everything. It runs because mortals are authorized to operate within it. And authorization is itself a kind of power. It is limited, it is conditional. It is never equal to the gods. But it is real enough that the text can imagine it being extended into defense priests using authorized procedures to consecrate, to purify, to deflect, to bind. If you want to know what prevents mortals from using divine instruments beyond their intended scope, the texts offer a quiet answer knowledge. The me are not arbitrary magic. They operate according to domain and invocation. To employ a me requires understanding its nature, its requirements, its proper sequence. That is why the ritual literature is so detailed. That is why it is guarded. That is why specialists exist. Not everyone can operate these mechanisms. And that perhaps is the compromise at the heart of Mesopotamian religion. Power is distributed, but literacy is rare. Authority is mediated, but training is long. Instruments can move, but procedures are difficult. The gods remain higher. Humans remain vulnerable. But vulnerability is not identical to helplessness. A trained practitioner is not omnipotent. But he is not only begging either. He is applying what the culture treats as legitimate, transmitted, authorized technique. And when we move back to K2950, that is what we are hearing beneath the wedges, a claim that procedure can intercept decree, because decree itself is mediated through structures that procedure can touch. So the next step is not to decide whether we believe any of this. The next step is to watch what happens when this cosmology becomes practice, when manuals become rituals, when protection is installed into architecture, when words become tools. We turn now from mythic instruments to the technical literature that treats those instruments as usable, because that is where the priesthood speaks in its own voice. And maybe that is why these myths keep being copied. Not because they are entertaining, but because they teach a lesson about systems authority can be disrupted when its instruments are taken. Order does not collapse only through rebellion. It can collapse through misplacement, a tablet unguarded, a moment of bathing, a moment of beer, a moment when a boundary is assumed to hold and someone discovers the seam. Enki speaking to a wall belongs to the same family of insights. It is not the strength of the warning that matters. It is the pathway. So when priests draw boundary lines, bury figurines at corners, speak formulae at thresholds, we are seeing the same imagination at work. If power expresses through mechanisms, then mechanisms can be met with counter-mechanisms, not to defeat the gods, to survive them. So we return to the vault again, because the myths teach the premise, but the manuals teach the practice. And K2950 is practice made portable. It is a tablet you can pick up, a thing you can hold. And on that held surface is an all-night ceremony broken into steps the way a legal contract is broken into clauses. Tablet the 8th in its series, the culmination. The burning that completes what previous preparations set in motion. The text specifies hours after sunset before dawn. It lists materials with a precision that feels almost like a recipe. It names forces by title and function. And then in the methodical Akkadian characteristic of Mesopotamian ritual literature, it explains how a human being standing in a temple courtyard can do something that looks from the outside like audacity, not please, not if it pleases, not have mercy. But do this, say, this, burn this, and the consequence follows. The verb in this literature is not always pray. It is closer to bind, to constrain, to redirect through procedure what was previously understood as will. And if this were a single text, a strange anomaly, we might still be tempted to call it theater. But the Burning series is not alone. It sits among manuals of purification and release, among defensive installations, among incantation series that treat hostile forces demonic, yes, but also divine, through the same operational grammar. There is a name that appears in this context, the Udug-Hul tradition, evil demons, and, in Akkadian, the Utukku. But what the tablets describe under those labels is not always what modern readers want demon to mean. The boundaries blur. Some of the forces named are obvious night terrors. Others are messengers, enforcers, executors of divine will, afflictions that arrive not from a realm outside the gods, but from within their administration. And the procedures do not pause to apologize for this blur. They do not say, this method works only for low spirits, not for high gods. They simply present an architecture purification, binding, expulsion, sealing. The same architecture that can drive off a demon can also, in certain defined cases, deflect a curse that originates from divine anger. So, the uncomfortable question returns again, with a slightly different angle. What if Mesopotamian religion preserved not only ways to honor the gods, but ways to survive their hostility? What if the priesthood's hidden expertise was not mainly about worship, but about defense? This is where modern interpretation tends to reach for a safe translation: psychological comfort, symbolic action, a way to feel agency. But K2950 does not read like a text designed primarily to make someone feel better. It reads like a text designed to be followed. Its success in its own terms depends on exactness, and exactness is expensive. Exactness requires training. Exactness requires literacy. Exactness requires copying, because memory alone drifts. which is why the ritual corpus is so large. It is not a single charm, it is a technical library, and that is why Ashurbanipal's library matters in this story. Not because a king loved stories, but because a king feared loss. Scribes were sent to preserve the knowledge of Mesopotamia before conquest, and collapse made it vulnerable. The project succeeded. Nineveh fell, and the fire that destroyed the palace hardened the tablets into survivable clay. The result is what we have now, an archive of procedures. And those procedures keep repeating a structural claim that the divine world is not only will, it is system. That power is not only raw force, it is mediated through protocols. That afflictions once imposed operate through patterns. That patterns can be disrupted through counterpatterns. That counterpatterns can be executed by trained mortals who possess the proper instruction. The priest in this worldview is not a magician in the modern fantasy sense. He is a technician, an operator, someone who knows which materials belong to which domain, which words align with which forces, which hours are receptive and which are dangerous. And if that sounds like a strange modernization, remember, Mesopotamia's basic habit is administrative. Even its myths are administrative. Councils meet, oaths bind, tasks are assigned, decisions are executed. The divine realm behaves like governance. So the priesthood, too, becomes governance at the level of procedure. Not sovereign governance, never that, but operational governance, the maintenance of boundaries, the dissolution of corruption, the release of what has attached. The burning manuals make that explicit in their form. They are not lyrical. They are procedural. They are designed to be used. And that again returns us to the same loop, the same question asked from another direction. If the gods decree, and if decree is mediated through structures that can be stolen, transferred, exploited, then is it possible, sometimes narrowly, for procedure to meet decree with procedure? Not to overthrow, not to declare independence, to intercept, to redirect, to make the world survivable. This is the atmosphere the tablets build. The claim is not that humans are free. The claim is that humans are not entirely helpless if they possess knowledge. And now we move from the idea of manuals to the idea of space. Because one of the most consistent assumptions in the ritual literature is that the world can be structured locally, that a house can be fortified, that a threshold can be guarded, that a boundary can be made thick enough to turn away what approaches. If words can function, then space can be engineered. And that is where the next layer of evidence waits the architecture of sacred defense. The night matters in these texts. Again and again, the ritual world moves into darkness, not because darkness is romantic, but because darkness is operational. Things happen at night. Attention is different at night. The manual does not say this in philosophy. It says it in scheduling. After sunset, before dawn, at the hour when ordinary work stops and the boundary between inside and outside feels thinner. The burning is not performed once. It is sustained, a sequence that keeps returning to the fire, keeps returning to the words, keeps returning to the same core claim that harm can be attached, and what is attached can be detached. This is where the modern mind wants to interrupt and ask, but did it really work? And the tablets answer with a different insistence. The question is misplaced. The better question is, what did they think they were doing? And the answer is they thought they were operating. They thought knowledge, once written, once preserved, could be applied. That the words like the me could move into the hands of trained humans. and remain functional there. The series, known to scholars as Beit Rimki House of the Ablution Bath, is reconstructed from fragments found across multiple sites. 7 tablets, possibly more. Complex, expensive rituals requiring days of preparation and precise execution. These were not casual performances. They were procedures for consecrating space, for transforming ordinary architecture into defended territory, for creating an environment where hostile forces, demonic or divine, do not simply enter. They meet resistance built into the structure itself. The tablets begin where an engineer would begin with preparation. First, the space must be purified. Water from specific sources. Water specified in the text. Water treated not as symbol, but as material with a function. Boundaries are marked. Lines drawn with flour, with oil, with the substances the manual names. At each boundary point, an incantation. At each threshold, a sequence. The tablets do not spend time persuading you why this matters. They assume the practitioner knows, because the practitioner has been trained. Then come the figurines, small images fashioned from clay, from wood, from precious materials when the patron can afford them. Images of protective beings, Apkallu, with cone and bucket, Lamassu, lion-headed, and eagle-bodied guardians, figures that appear in art and reliefs, but which in the ritual literature are not mere decoration. They are operators. The tablets specify where they go under thresholds, at corners within walls. Depth matters. Orientation matters. Accompanying materials matter. A figurine buried incorrectly is not simply less meaningful, it is ineffective. The procedure requires precision, because the protection derives not from the sculpture's beauty, but from its integration into space according to the logic of the ritual. The figurine is an anchor point, a node in a defended perimeter. Installed correctly, it stands in the place where intrusion would cross from outside to inside, and it intercepts. The text claims that hostile forces approaching a house meet these installed guardians first, that they are turned away, that divine anger directed at the inhabitants can strike the installed defenses and exhaust itself there rather than reaching its target. Again, modern skepticism prefers to hear symbolism in this. It prefers to hear comfort. But the tablets describe effects, measurable within their world. A household afflicted employs Beit Rimki. The affliction departs. A family under curse installs the figures. The curse is redirected, dissipated, or strikes elsewhere. And whether we translate that into modern categories or not, we have to notice the logic. It is systematic. It assumes space can be modified. It assumes boundaries can be strengthened. It assumes protective forces can be installed so that protection persists after the ritual ends. That persistence is crucial. Prayer requires ongoing attention. Petition depends on a god's current mood. But a consecrated boundary in this literature behaves like a structure. Once built, it stands until it degrades or is undone. This is why the ritual specialists are specialists. The IPU, the exorcist specialist, does not simply speak. He builds, he installs, he configures. He operates on a house the way an engineer operates on an irrigation canal, by altering its conditions so that certain flows are redirected, blocked, or permitted. And the logic scales. What is done to a house can be done in principle to a gate, a wall, a city boundary, The massive lamassu that flank Assyrian palace gateways are presented to modern tourists as art, as symbols of protection. But in the ritual logic, they are part of protection. Stone made into a threshold guardian through consecration, a huge node in the same network of defended space. Cities, too, are treated as spaces that can be made thick. Walls are physical, yes, but they are also consecrated boundaries. Rituals at foundation and at corners. Procedures at gates. The city becomes defended not only by stone and soldiers, but by installed cosmic structure. And this is why siege warfare is never only physical in the Mesopotamian imagination. An attacking army brings priests. Before rams strike walls, procedures are performed to undo the enemy's protections, to loosen the bindings woven into architecture. Again, we can call this psychology. We can call it confidence. But the texts themselves call it technique. They treat protective architecture as real enough that it must be countered by counter-procedure. And notice the implication that keeps returning the one the tablets never fully hide. Divine force can be hostile. Divine anger is listed among the things that must be deflected. Not all attention is blessing. Not all will is benevolent. Sometimes the gods send plague. Sometimes they send curse. Sometimes they direct destructive force for reasons humans may not even know. So, Bit Rimki is not merely protection against demons in a modern horror sense. It is protection against a cosmos that includes hostility at multiple levels. It is procedural defense against the fact that humans live under powers they do not control. And yet this is the crucial twist. The texts insist those powers are not beyond structure. That protection is possible because cosmic operation is lawful enough to permit it. That the same principles that authorize force also authorize boundary. This is why errors matter so much. The tablets acknowledge failure. Sometimes protection is breached. Disease enters despite consecration. Anger strikes despite defense. And the explanation is not the gods are random. The explanation is procedural. A line drawn incorrectly, a figurine mispositioned, an incantation spoken imperfectly, engineering logic. Systems fail when implemented incorrectly. So, the response is not to abandon the system, it is to execute it more precisely. Better training, better copying, better memory, better procedure. And now we can feel how this connects back to everything we have already seen. If knowledge is inherited, if procedures are preserved, if cosmic structure is stable enough to be engaged, then sacred architecture is not metaphor. It is operation. A house becomes defended territory. A threshold becomes a working boundary. And the human inhabitants gain something rare in a world of divine powers, room to operate. From here, the ritual literature turns from space to the body, from boundaries in walls to boundaries in persons, from defended houses to purified lives. Because once you can build defense, you can also burn away what has already attached. And that is where the next series waits the burning procedures directed not at demons alone, but at divine curses themselves. Archaeologists still find the material echo of this logic. Small clay figures under thresholds, at corners and foundations, silent proof that someone once took these instructions seriously enough to bury them in the vulnerable places of a home. The houses collapsed, the cities shifted, the walls turned to dust. But the figurines remained positioned, as the manual said, to position them marking the points where ancient practitioners tried to make a boundary thick. The texts and the dirt agree on at least this much: the procedures were performed. There is another series, also described in the language of burning, that turns the logic of defense inward. Not the defense of walls, the defense of the afflicted. A corpus that scholars reconstruct as 9 tablets, procedures directed specifically at divine curses, not demonic possession, not witchcraft performed by human enemies. Divine curses, afflictions that originate from the gods themselves imposed as punishment for offense, for taboo, violated for boundary crossed. And the assumption underneath this literature is striking. It assumes that divine curses once imposed can be removed through mortal procedure, not easily, not cheaply, not without days of preparation, careful materials, and exact execution, but possible. The practitioner is the IPU, again the specialist, the one trained not only to pray, but to operate. And the authority claimed in these texts is not the authority of personal charisma. It is procedural authority technique, attributed again and again to Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. The texts invoke Ea not as a benevolent deity being begged to intervene, but as the original author of technique. The incantations speak in imperatives, not may the curse depart, but you curse depart. You pollution dissolve. You anger be released. The words do not sound like pleading. They sound like commands, and the commands are framed as valid because the procedure is valid, because Ea designed purification to work, because purification is part of cosmic structure, because to resist purification once properly executed would be to resist the principles that make purification what it is. The materials are specified with the same obsessive care we saw in sacred defense: cedar, tamarisk, combinations of flour and oil. Water drawn from named sources. The manual does not treat these substances as mere symbols. Each has associations: purity, incorruptibility, proximity to water, and those associations are treated as functional. Burn the materials while speaking the words. Pour water at the moment the text specifies. Maintain sequence. Maintain timing. Pronunciation matters not because the gods are picky, but because the procedure is a mechanism. A mechanism depends on fit. The logic is systems analysis applied to affliction. The curse is treated as structured. It attaches through channels. It persists through patterns. Interfere with those patterns through correct counter patterns. Fire against pollution water, against contamination, and the curse loses integrity. It cannot maintain itself in conditions hostile to its continuation. Academic scholarship often translates this into social and psychological terms. The ritual marks a transition. The community sees the afflicted as cleansed. The person feels relief. The performance creates meaning. And of course, the ritual did create meaning. But the tablets are not written as if meaning is the primary output. They are written as if dissolution is the output. They read like instructions for disrupting a mechanism. And they acknowledge complexity. The texts differentiate between divine anger from known causes and anger from unknown causes. Known causes require confession, acknowledgement-specific address to the offended deity. Unknown causes require comprehensive purification that targets all possible sources simultaneously because the practitioner does not know which god is angry or why. But in both cases, the goal is the same: not to ask the anger to leave, to remove it, to release it, to loosen what is attached. And that word release keeps echoing across the ritual corpus because it is the hinge between decree and operation. If a curse can be loosened, then it is not absolute. It is powerful, yes. It hurts. It kills. It ruins households. But once imposed, it operates according to principle. And principle can be met with principle. This is the unsettling implication for divine authority. If a human technician can remove what divine will imposed, then divine will is not limitless. It is constrained by the structure that makes it effective. The gods can curse. But the cosmos also contains purification. The cosmos contains release. The cosmos contains mechanisms by which corruption can be dissolved. And the practitioner's role is to create those conditions materially and verbally, so that the curse exhausts itself, disperses, dissipates. Not because the gods change their minds necessarily, because the state of the afflicted person has been changed. The attachment points have been removed. The pattern no longer has purchase. Again, engineering logic. You do not defeat a mechanism by pleading with it. You defeat a mechanism by changing its conditions. Fire transforms, water washes, words align. The procedure, if done correctly, shifts the system into a new state. And this is why the literature is so anxious about error. A boundary line drawn wrong, a pronunciation flawed, a sequence reversed. The curse persists not because the cosmos is arbitrary, but because the counter mechanism was not properly engaged. So the answer is always the same: more training, more precision, more fidelity to the text. Because fidelity in this worldview is what makes technique work. We can hear in this the continuity of the older myths. A tablet of destinies can be stolen. The me can be transferred. An oath can be worked around. A curse can be dissolved. All of these are expressions of the same assumption. Cosmic operation is procedural enough that procedure matters. And now, having seen defense in space and purification, in the person we come to a more paradoxical category, the procedures for averting what has been revealed by omen before it happens, rituals that treat fate itself as something that can be loosened. Because if the gods reveal the future and humans can still avert it, then we are standing directly on the boundary between decree and agency. That boundary is where the Namburbi rituals live. A fragment in the British Museum, catalogued as K150, preserves part of this burning literature in a Neo-Assyrian hand. Yet inside that later copy, you can still hear older layers, Sumerian passages, archaic technical terms, linguistic time compressed into one working procedure. The tablet is not presenting itself as new. It is presenting itself as preserved, and that preservation shapes the tone. The incantations speak to forces as if they can hear. Second person, imperative. You curse, depart. You anger, be released. The text does not say, please gods, remove what you sent. It speaks as if the curse once imposed is now a structured entity that can be compelled because cosmic law grants purification, that authority. Another fragment, K2611, differentiates between anger with known cause and anger with unknown cause. Again, not as philosophical speculation, but as technical troubleshooting. If you know which boundary was crossed, you name it. If you do not, you widen the net. You purify comprehensively. This is what makes the burning literature feel less like devotion and more like maintenance. It is a toolkit for failure states, a way of responding when maintenance has become assault, and the afflicted needs not consolation, but procedure that changes conditions. The word appears across hundreds of tablets excavated from Nineveh, Assur, Babylon, procedures scholars call namburbi. In Sumerian, the phrase is namburbi. It's loosening, it's release. And even the name feels like a statement. Not destruction, not overthrow, release, loosening. A pattern being unfastened before it tightens into consequence. Because namburbi belongs to a category of ritual that exists only if a certain cosmology is true, the Mesopotamians practiced divination extensively. They read omens in the livers of sacrificed animals in oil dropped on water, in the flight of birds, in the positions of stars, in eclipses, dreams, accidents, anything that might carry a sign. And the omen literature is not casual, it is systematic. If, then texts. Libraries of correlation. If this sign appears, then this consequence follows. The structure is technical enough that we still recognize it as a kind of analysis, even if we do not share its premises. So divination creates a problem. If omens reveal coming disaster, and if omens are tied to divine decision, then disaster is decreed. Fated, inevitable. The omen is not a warning so much as a notice. Under that assumption, human response should be submission, preparation, acceptance. But namburbi assumes something different. It assumes that many omens reveal probable futures, not fixed fates. It assumes there is a window between the sign and the consequence, a gap where procedure can be applied. And in that gap, the ritual specialist operates. Name the omen. Name the predicted evil. Perform the material actions. Speak the incantations. Invoke the authority that authorizes release. Redirect, dissolve, substitute so that the predicted disaster does not manifest. This is the paradox that makes modern readers uncomfortable. If the gods revealed the omen, then averting the omen seems like resisting the gods. So, the safe academic solution is often to say Mesopotamians held inconsistent beliefs. They were not systematic thinkers. They practiced divination and also practiced magic to undo what divination revealed because they wanted comfort, not coherence. But the tablets themselves are more careful than that reading allows. They differentiate between omens. They specify which can be averted and which cannot. They acknowledge that some fates are fixed, others contingent, others modifiable. The framework is not chaos. It is nuance. Fate is complex. Authority is distributed. And cosmic operation follows principle. Within that framework, namburbi is not contradiction. It is complement. Divination reveals patterns. Namburbi modifies patterns. Both are legitimate operations in a structured cosmos, and the procedures themselves make their logic visible. Many involve substitution. A figurine is made representing the threatened person. The ritual transfers the predicted evil from the person to the substitute. The substitute is destroyed, buried, burned, cast into water, and the evil departs with it. The underlying assumption is precise patterns can attach to representatives. Attachment can be redirected. Destruction of the representative can discharge the pattern before it reaches its original target. Other procedures involve purification. The threatened person undergoes washing, fumigation, cleansing, removing the attachment points where the evil would take hold. Without purchase, the pattern cannot execute. It dissipates, seeking a foothold, finding none. This is not random. It is systematic thinking about causality. Evil requires a channel. Remove the channel, and the effect cannot occur even if the sign predicted it. So what then is an omen? In this worldview, an omen is not a final decree. It is a diagnostic. It is information about a trajectory. And information is useful precisely because trajectories can sometimes be altered. That is why the rituals exist. That is why they are copied. That is why courts employ them. Not as fringe superstition, but as mainstream technology of survival in a world where divine attention is dangerous and signs arrive whether you want them or not. Of course, skepticism can always say perhaps the disaster would not have occurred anyway. Perhaps Namburbi merely coincided with relief. Perhaps the rituals were remembered when they worked and forgotten when they failed. But within the Mesopotamian framework, success is observed. Omen predicts evil procedure is executed. Evil does not manifest. The causal relationship becomes through repetition, a kind of evidence. Enough evidence to justify preservation. And again, we return to the same loop we keep tracing. If the cosmos is structured, then structure can be engaged. If fate is mediated through patterns, then patterns can be loosened. If decree operates through channels, then channels can be redirected. Namburbi does not deny divine power. It assumes divine power works through system, and system creates seams. The ritual specialist does not overthrow fate. He releases it. He loosens the binding before it tightens. He operates in the window between sign and consequence. Not always, not universally. The texts acknowledge limits, but often enough that the tradition becomes a library. So, when we ask why a priest would believe he can intercept what the gods have decreed, we do not need to invent a modern rebellion narrative. We can simply listen to the ritual logic decree is not pure whim. It is mediated through structures that knowledge can touch. That is what Namburbi preserves. Not the fantasy of freedom, but the technique of intervention. And that technique, once again, is traced back to the same source of authorization, Ea, Enki, the one who knows how the system bends because he designed the system to bend. Which brings us inevitably back to Enki, not just as mythic trickster, but as the consistent sponsor of human capability. Because the deeper question behind all of this remains, why is this knowledge available at all? Why is the system built with seams? Why is release possible? The ritual corpus answers again and again with the same name. In Ashurbanipal's library, dozens of these procedures sit beside the omen texts themselves, as if the archive is pairing diagnosis with response. An eclipse is observed. It portends royal disaster. The court does not merely record the sign, it reaches for the loosening ritual. A liver configuration suggests revolt. The sign is read. Then the counter procedure is performed, and the language of the ritual is telling. It is not framed as may the gods reconsider. It is framed as enactment. This evil is released. This fate is loosened. This consequence is redirected. The invocation of divine names functions like authorization, not like pleading, appealing to the authority of Ea, who established the principles, sometimes calling on protective forces, sometimes naming the predicted evil so it can be handled. The paradox dissolves when we stop forcing an all-or-nothing fate model onto the texts. The Mesopotamian cosmos has fixed elements and flexible elements, decrees that stand and decrees that can be redirected, omens that announce inevitability and omens that announce vulnerability. Namburbi lives in that vulnerable zone, and the fact that it is copied so extensively suggests how often people believed they were living there. We have been circling one name for hours now, and the circle is not accidental. Enki, Ea, the god of wisdom of deep waters, of craft and system, who across Mesopotamian literature appears again and again as the one who arms humanity with knowledge. Not sentimental knowledge, operational knowledge, knowledge that functions like leverage. And the question that keeps returning is simple enough to say and difficult enough to sit with. Why would a god teach mortals procedures for resisting divine will? Because the rituals do not merely ask for protection. They claim to bind. They claim to release. They claim to dissolve what has been imposed. They claim in certain conditions to deflect even divine anger. So why is that claim even thinkable? The mythology offers an answer, but it is an answer that breaks the comfortable picture of unified divinity. The flood narrative makes it explicit. The Anunnaki Council decides to destroy humanity because humans have become too numerous, too noisy, too problematic. Divine consensus settles on extermination. Enki is bound by oath not to interfere. And Enki interferes anyway through technicality. He speaks to a wall. He transmits knowledge without formally violating his word. He ensures survival when the divine majority decreed extinction. That is not an isolated scene. It is a pattern. Enki repeatedly distributes capability downward, sometimes directly, sometimes through the Apkallu, sometimes through stories of transfer and theft that still end with humans holding what they did not invent. The pattern is consistent enough that the ritual literature treats Enki not as a vague patron of magic, but as the specific author of defensive technique. The burning procedures invoke him. Purification is attributed to him. The release of omens is performed under his authority. Exorcistic literature, the Udug-hul/Utuku traditions invoke his name to bind and expel hostile forces. And those hostile forces, the texts admit, include messengers and executors of divine will. The method for driving off a demon and the method for driving off a divine enforcer share the same logic: bind, command, expel, seal. This is startling when stated plainly. It implies that divine enforcement is not absolute within the system, that a force sent to punish can be met by counter-procedure if the counter-procedure is authorized by the one who administers cosmic structure. So, Enki's role begins to look less like benevolence and more like strategy. In Mesopotamian thought, civilization is not optional. Temples must be maintained, rituals must be performed, offerings must be organized, irrigation must be managed. The world in these texts does not run itself. It is a system of maintenance, and humans are part of that maintenance. They are operators at the material level of cosmic order. Destroy them completely, and you do not only silence noise, you risk disrupting the machinery of civilization, that the gods themselves depend on the flow of offerings, the upkeep of sacred space, the daily labor that makes temples function. So Enki's investment in human capability can be read as pragmatic. He sides with humanity not because he denies divine order, but because he understands what order requires. Capable humans. Surviving humans. Humans who can keep functioning even when other divine factions, represented most clearly by Enlil, prefer human limitation, reduction, simplification. This reframes the ritual corpus as evidence of cosmic politics, not a war of good and evil, but a tension inside the divine hierarchy. Different priorities, different agendas, humans caught between them. And the priesthood in this view is not neutral. It aligns. It claims Enki's authority. It uses Enki's names. It preserves traditions that trace back to Enki's sages. It treats itself as custodian of knowledge that one divine faction distributed, so humanity would not be helpless before another faction's hostility. That is why the secret distribution is not secret, because it is hidden, but secret because it reveals division. It reveals that the gods do not speak with one voice, that procedures can be authorized against procedures, that a curse can be imposed by one authority and dissolved under another. So the priest becomes not merely mediator, but operator within a contested cosmos. He cannot overthrow the divine, but he can sometimes choose which divine architecture he will operate under, which authority he will invoke, which technical lineage he will claim, Enki's. And if that seems too political, remember Mesopotamian myths are political. They are administrative. They are obsessed with who holds what, who is authorized, who can decree. Their theology is governance. So their ritual technology becomes governance as well, a practical way of surviving the consequences of divided authority. And now the loop closes back toward the beginning. K2950 sits in a vault because a civilization believed procedures mattered enough to preserve. A civilization believed knowledge, once given, could not be fully taken back. A civilization believed that when divine forces turned hostile, technique could create room to breathe. If you're still with this, if the circle has held, then we are ready to return to the tablet one last time and ask the only question it ultimately demands. What does it mean to possess a manual that claims you can resist what the gods decreed? The material culture echoes the same alignment. Protective amulets, small clay or stone objects inscribed with abbreviated incantations invoke Enki's name. They are miniature versions of longer rituals compressed into something wearable, buriable, carryable. They claim ongoing defense, not through constant petition, but through constant installation. The bearer is placed under an authority. Thousands of such objects have been excavated across centuries. They appear in wealthy contexts and poor contexts alike, which suggests that procedural protection was not an elite theory. It was daily life. It was how people tried to keep a boundary between their bodies and forces they believed could cross that boundary. Modern readers, shaped by monotheistic habits, often assume a unified divine will. The gods become, in that unconscious grammar, a single authority. Mesopotamian texts resist that. They show councils' factions competing priorities. They show instruments stolen and installed oaths, exploited decisions undermined. In that world, obedience is not a single relationship. It is a landscape. And Enki's role as distributor of defensive knowledge suggests that human survival depended on knowing that landscape, on aligning with the authority that permits protection, on invoking the name that authorizes release, on using technique to navigate divided power. So the priesthood's procedures begin to look less like superstition and more like strategy, not rebellion against divinity, but operation inside divine politics. And that brings us back to the word the tablets never quite stop circling: resistance. Not rebellion, not conquest. Resistance as technical survival, like Enki, speaking to a wall, like a priest speaking to a fire, like a ritual speaking to fate before fate hardens. One last time, we return to the vault and let the clay ask its quiet question again. So we end where we began, in the vault. Not because the vault is dramatic, but because the vault is honest. It holds what survived. K2950 sits in climate-controlled quiet. The clay will outlast us. The wedges will outlast the arguments we make about them. The tablet does not demand belief. It demands literacy. It demands patience. It demands the willingness to read a manual as a manual and to notice what kind of universe a manual assumes. A universe where timing matters, where sequence matters, where words are not only expression but function, where material and cosmic are interwoven enough that burning a figurine is not merely symbolic but operational. We have followed that assumption outward through the archive, the flood text where Enki speaks to a wall, the sages who transmit instruction from before the waters, the me that structures civilization and can be transferred, the tablet of destinies that can be stolen, the defended house made thick by buried guardians, the burning procedures that dissolve curses, the Namburbi rituals that loosen an omen before it becomes a wound. Again and again, the same pattern appears. Authority exists, but authority is mediated. Decree is real. But decree moves through structure, and structure has seams. The priesthood's claim preserved in clay is that trained humans can work with those seams, sometimes to deflect, sometimes to release, sometimes to survive what would otherwise land unfiltered. Not always, not absolutely, but enough that procedures were worth writing down, worth copying down, worth guarding down. And if we step back for a moment, we can see the deeper irony the tablets carry. The same civilization that feared divine hostility also believed divine knowledge was the only defense against it. The same cosmos that produced curses also produced purification. The same gods who decreed also bound themselves by oath. The same system that threatened humanity also contained a loophole wide enough for a warning to pass through. Enki, speaking to a wall, is not only a clever scene in a flood story. It is a template. It says rules constrain power. And those who understand rules can sometimes move where they are not supposed to move. When a ritual text tells a priest to speak these words at this hour with these materials, it is asking the priest to do the same kind of thing on a smaller scale. It is asking him to align with structure so that structure produces an outcome. So what do we do with this? Now, we do not need to believe it in a modern sense in order to take it seriously as evidence. We can simply recognize what the texts claim and what that claim reveals about Mesopotamian thought, a world where religion and technique are not opposites, where worship and operation are braided, where the divine is not only a being to adore, but a system to navigate. And we can recognize, too, why modern interpretations reach for safety. It is safer to say theater than to admit technology. Safer to say comfort than to admit procedure. Safer to imagine helpless ancient people than to imagine trained practitioners working with a complex cosmology that treated agency as real, though limited. But the clay is not safe. The clay is specific. The clay is procedural. It is in its own way uncompromising. Which brings us back to the question that began the whole arc, the question we have asked in different words and must ask again before we stop. What if knowledge once given cannot be fully taken back? What if procedures once taught remain operational regardless of who performs them? What if resistance was never about strength, but about literacy, about knowing which words to speak into the fire while the night holds its breath? That question does not resolve into a neat moral. The Mesopotamian archive rarely offers neat morals. It offers case studies. It offers mechanisms. It offers patterns of escalation and response harm and defense decree and loophole. And that may be why it was copied for so long. Because a civilization does not preserve only comfort. It preserves what it thinks it might need again. A ritual manual is preserved for reuse. A procedure is preserved because the world keeps producing the conditions that require it. And if the Mesopotamians were right about anything, they were right about that repetition. The breaking point returns, the curse returns, the omen returns, the night returns, and the question of how to survive what is larger than you returns as well. So K2950 waits. The words wait, the instructions wait, not for worship, for readers, for practitioners once and now, for translators and listeners, and anyone patient enough to hear the old logic without immediately forcing it into modern categories. If you want to keep walking through these tablets slowly, carefully, without flattening them into slogans, then stay close to the procedures. Read what they wrote. Let the repetition do its work. And let the uncomfortable possibility remain what it is, a possibility worth thinking about in the dark. Because in the end, that is what the archive preserves best. Not answers, instructions, and the stubborn human insistence that even in a world ruled by God's knowledge can carve out a narrow space where a mortal can say through procedure, not in open rebellion, but in precise operation, not this, not now, not yet. And there is one more irony the archive keeps offering. Nineveh burned. Ashurbanipal's library collapsed into rubble. What was meant to be destroyed became harder to erase because fire does to clay. What ritual fire is always doing in these texts, it transforms, it hardens, it fixes a fragile thing into a durable state. The flood narrative carries the same irony. A plan meant to erase becomes the mechanism through which a remnant is preserved. Destruction becomes the container for survival. And the archive centuries later repeats that pattern in material form. Catastrophe becomes preservation. So when we stand mentally inside that London vault, we are standing inside the afterlife of the same logic. A manual about burning survived because a city burned. And the tablets are not only in London. Fragments sit in Philadelphia, in Baghdad, in collections scattered across the world the way Mesopotamian cities once scattered copies, so that no single loss would be final. The knowledge is fragmented, but the pattern remains visible, which means the question is not only ancient, it is present every time a reader reconstructs a broken procedure, every time a translator tries to keep the sequence intact, every time we choose whether to treat these texts as symbols or as techniques. Because how we read them changes what they mean.